Hello. You may recall that last week I had a video that was about 30 minutes long that was talking about slaves and employers and also about the workplace. And I decided to split it in half. So last week we did only the first 15 minutes of it, which was about slavery and slaves and masters. Today, I want to continue with the second part of that same video. We're going to be looking at the same passage, but thinking about how it applies to the workplace today rather than to slavery. So let me start by reading the passage. Since in the video, part of the video that I'll pick up on, it doesn't start with a passage. It assumes you've already just seen it. So let me read it now, and then we'll pick up with the next part of the video. The passage says this: Slaves, be obedient to those of your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service, as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he'll receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Last time we talked about the fact that for slaves, they were first of all being asked to submit to their human masters, not because they just of the authority those masters had, but because they wanted to do so for the Lord's sake, for the gospel's sake. And they were to see that as they served their masters, they were in reality serving Jesus and looking to Jesus to be pleased by how they did things and looking to Jesus to give them the reward. And that masters in turn were not supposed to think of themselves as superior to their slaves, but to recognize that we both have a common master in Christ. They were supposed to think that way. All right, today we're going to look at the way in which this applies to the workplace. And with that, I'll let the rest of the previous video take it away. Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about how this applies to the workplace, because most Christians that I know do apply this to the workplace. They try to think about how we can obey our employers in all things. And the first thing I want to say is slavery isn't the same thing as employment. Being a slave is not the same thing as being a worker. They're different things. The workplace is different from slavery. So we can apply some of the same principles, but the verses are not direct commands to us as workers. And we can still apply this, and that's what I'm going to go on and look at. But it's just important that we not think that when this says slaves obey your masters, that means we need to obey our employers in exactly the same way. What we're doing is trying to understand how we can learn from the principles for slavery here and apply it to the workplace for us. What's equivalent to us? What is the same for us? So the first thing to think about, So the first thing to think about is, let me say one more thing before I do that. As we go forward, I also want to mention, I don't have the time to get into this, but we work at very different jobs. And when I've talked with people, I find that everybody tends to think that every job is like their own. But all our jobs are different. If you're working in a factory, or if you're working in a fast food place, or if you're a teacher, a professor, or a doctor, there are very different experiences that you have. Or if you're the boss of the manager at a factory, you have very different responsibilities and very different ways of fulfilling the living for the gospel. And it will look very different. And so don't forget that as you think about this, that not everybody is in the same position or has the same kinds of responsibilities or same kind of questions and in their workplace. And so we need to really give each other grace and understand that there's a lot of diversity here. Okay, now let's think about how this does apply. First of all, I said with slavery that that's something that is not embedded in the nature of things. It's kind of a bad thing. Slavery is something that God is working history towards abolishing. And when Jesus comes, there will be release of the captives. So slavery is not embedded in the nature of things, but work is. Work was around before the fall. Adam was created and given a job. And so it's important to remember that having workers and having people pay for work and having an economic system which is built on that is not essentially a fallen thing. It's not essentially a bad thing. So the ideal that we should picture isn't an ideal in which none of us works at all. It's an ideal in which we do work. But still, the fall affected work. Adam was told after he sinned, the ground will produce thorns and thistles. In other words, your work will get harder and it will also become pointless in some cases. You're going to work hard and not accomplish anything. And this is still true in every area of work. I'm a teacher. I work sometimes very hard, prepare lectures, talk with students, create assignments, grade them, give them lots of feedback, and then there's a student who just pays no attention to what I'm doing. Or sometimes they are paying attention and I just can't figure out how to help them pass the class. So there are times when we try things and we try to work at them and they just don't work. That's the thorns and thistles of the fall. One day that will be gone. Imagine being able to work at what you are doing and know that everything you're doing, you could have success just simply because you put the work in. There were no thorns, there were no thistles. It was fruitful in every way. That would be a great joy. It wouldn't take away the work of it, but it wouldn't feel like work. It would feel like play. And that's sort of the difference between the work after the fall and the work as it would have been before the fall. Also, in a perfect world, each of us would be doing the work that he's best designed for by God. I think when Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom on earth, we'll still probably do work, but I think the work will be exactly the way you're designed. And you'll find that your work is your play, that your work is the thing you enjoy doing and the thing that people are paying you for. So one day work will be very different. It's not going to be anything like the socialist ideal for work, but it's also not going to be anything like the capitalist ideal for work. It's going to be something completely different than what the world systems are, for whichever side they're on. So work is a good thing, but the way work is right now and the system of work right now isn't always completely the best way. And that's something we need to acknowledge. All right, the essence of the passage that we were looking at is that is to work in a way that makes the gospel appealing. I guess what I mean is this. The essence of the passage for slavery was do it for the gospel's sake. Submit to your masters for the sake of the gospel. And in the same way here it says, as you're at work, as you're in the workplace, that essence, that essential principle will apply to us just as much in our workplace as it did to slaves. If even slaves who were so unfairly situated were supposed to serve and obey in a way that brought glory to the gospel, how much should we do even more the kind of work that makes the gospel appealing? We want to live and work and manage our workers, whatever position we're in a way that makes people think that's somebody who I want to listen to. That's somebody who seems to know something about what's right and wrong and what's loving, and that's somebody who really captures the gospel by how they live. We want to live and work in a way that people are drawn to the gospel because of the way that we do things. So the goal is to work or manage workers in such a way that Christ shines through us, and that's true. We want to show the love of Christ. So read this. We would read it this way: workers, be obedient to those your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling before God, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. Work sincerely, not as by way of eye service as men pleasers, but work in a way that you're serving Christ, that you're doing your work for him, that you're doing the will of God from the heart. With goodwill, render service as to the Lord in whatever your job is, not to men, knowing that God will reward you for that. And masters, in other words, people, employers and bosses and managers and administrators, behave in the same way towards those who are under you. Don't think of yourself as superior. Don't use threatening or abusive tactics to try to get what you want. Treat them with gentleness and kindness, and know that God is evaluating you just as much as he's evaluating them. And he will be watching to see how you treat those that you have some authority over. Okay, but let's think a little bit further. Slaves were told to obey. So is that true for workers? Well, sort of and sort of not. For slaves, obedience was expected in all things, and it was expected 24/7. But I am not expected as a worker to do everything my employer might choose to ask of me. I'm only required to do those things he's paying me for, to do those things that are part of my job description. He doesn't have the authority to tell me, oh, by the way, on the weekend, I want you to go do this or go do that, unless that's part of my job. So authority for us is limited to the areas for which we're being paid, the things we've agreed to do. But for those things, we need to be obedient. It might be clearer to think of yourself as being a faithful steward, which is another image used in Scripture. That might be a closer picture of work, that I've been given a stewardship. I've been entrusted with certain things by my employers, and I want to be a faithful steward. I want to be faithful to fulfill what they've contracted me to do. I'm a teacher. That means I need to be teaching in a way that I can say I have done what they expected me to do, both by the students and by the administrators of my school. So it might be clear to think of yourself as a faithful steward. Regardless, it's easy for me to be a good follower or to be a bad follower. A good follower is somebody that is easy to lead, and a bad follower is somebody who's very difficult to lead. So if I'm not in charge of my college, but my college administrators want us to do certain things, to fill out certain paperwork or follow certain procedures, and I should be trying to help make their jobs easier. I should be helping them to be successful as they do what they do. And the same kind of thing is true sort of in every situation. So still, obedience and submission in a certain sense is important. So slaves, it's saying here, worker, it would be like saying workers, be faithful to those of your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, to fulfill what you've promised to do in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye services, men pleasers, but really doing what they are asking you to do and what you've promised to try to do. That kind of a thing here. Okay. Remember that the main idea for slaves was to see that Christ is the true master. And in the same way, this is true as workers, except I think because we're thinking of ourselves as stewards and not merely as masters, as human slaves and masters, it's important to focus on the fact that Christ is the one who evaluates our work. We're seeking to please him. I want to be a teacher that Christ is pleased by the work I put into it, by the heart I have in it, by the faithfulness I have to it. I'll just reference 2 Timothy 2:3-6. That uses examples of people who evaluate our work in three different areas as metaphors for how we want to spiritually please Christ. But it shows, it can, in a funny way, it works the other way around too. It shows us how Christ is a picture of the one who evaluates everything we do. Slaves, so it is, we serve as Christ. We're doing the good with the will of God from the heart. We're rendering service as to the Lord, not to men. And we know we will receive back from the Lord whatever the result is of what we've done. Notice again, we're supposed to serve from the heart. The slaves were told to serve from the heart. Let it be real. Let it be authentic. Let it not just be external, but real. I will just say one more thing about that. We need to strike a balance in our work. And I found this to be tricky in my own life. On the one hand, we need an internal perspective. I need to see that no matter how hard I work at whatever job I'm doing, what really matters is what Christ has called us to, what Christ has done. Only what's done for Christ will last. So in one sense, you know, if I start pinning my hopes and my identity and my purpose on what I'm going to accomplish in my work, either the money I'll make or the research papers I'll write or the discoveries I'll create or the people I'll help through this or that, what makes those valuable is simply that they are service to Christ and that they're done for the kingdom. It's not, there's not a value to just human busyness that doesn't go to the purpose of glorifying God. But at the same time, Christ does call us to live for him in this world. So doing my secular job well can actually be what I do for Christ. A lot of Christians say, how do we glorify Christ in the workplace? And then they write books and do conferences about how they were in the workplace and were able to share the gospel, or in the workplace and able to talk about God. That's tremendous. But if you're in the workplace as a doctor, don't just think about when you talk about God as being when you're glorifying God. Think about when you help people get well as being when you glorify God. If you're a teacher, don't think about it just glorifying God when you talk about the gospel. Think about it glorifying God when you help people to understand math or whatever else you're teaching. The work we do, if we do it with the right heart, and if it's a work that can be done, that's not like sinful or something, the work we do is part of how we glorify Christ, and we can take great joy in that. That's sort of, again, the idea here is that, I just wanted to mention masters then. Masters do the same things to them. Give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven. There's no partiality with him. Again, that does apply sort of indirectly. The principle applies for employers and managers. Don't threaten. Don't use abusive stuff to get at people, and be fair and just and kind and generous. And don't think there's any partiality. All right, let me just have one final slide here. That's just mentioned in my experience. There's so much more I'd love to say about this, but I need to stop here because this is as far as Ephesians goes. In my experience, work is one of the areas of the greatest discouragement and defeat for many Christians. I know a lot of people who every other area of their lives is going great spiritually, but when it comes to their work and to where they are in the workplace, they just feel completely defeated. They feel like there's no way to really live out being a Christian there. And that can be true for a lot of reasons. And I don't know I can't tell you how to solve that now. I just want to point out that it's often true and that it doesn't have to be. Finding spiritual victory in our jobs, I think that can release so much joy, so much fruitfulness in our lives. And it's the most obvious way that we can learn to do something about loving God and loving people. It's the most obvious way we can learn to be the church everywhere, is by learning how to do our jobs and live within our jobs in a way that we find the call of God for that. Whatever your job is, even if it's secular and not spiritual, it has great spiritual value if you can learn to do it for Christ. And I don't know how to do that for you because every job is different. But I can say in my life, as I have fought through that battle, because I was definitely very discouraged early on in my life about it, if you can fight through that and figure out how to make your job your calling, in a sense, how to find your calling as a worker wherever you are, that is definitely worth it. It can transform your spiritual life in other ways. And so let me just encourage you all to do what you can with that. Seek help, pray, get advice from friends, and try to figure that out if you can. You may not have an issue with that, in which case help the others around you who do. And I'll see you next week. Thanks.